Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Nathan Masters. I'm one of the organizers of this event for the USC Libraries. I'm also the host of the public television series Lost LA. First of all, I want to thank Eric Lawyer and the students from the Amundsen Lab for sharing their immersive digital artwork called or titled The Path Ahead. Their presentation just concluded, but I think we're going to figure out a way to share it publicly going forward. I also want to thank my co-organizers, Bo Daub and Curtis Fletcher, as well as the events and grants team at USC, Tyson Gaskill, Patty Johnson, Bill Dotson, and Tim Stanton. For those of you who are on or near the USC campus, I also want to note that an exhibit curated around tonight's event by Bo Daub is currently on display outside Special Collections on Doheny Library's second floor. It'll only be up until March 16th, though, so see it soon. Thanks to all the members of our impressive panel, and thanks to our sponsor, Visions and Voices, and everyone on the Visions and Voices team for making tonight's event possible. I have a brief statement to read. The Visions and Voices program acknowledges that USC was built on the sacred land of the Tongva Nation. We honor the Tongva and all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and their continued survival and contributions to our society. So before tossing it over to our panel, I want to introduce our distinguished moderator, Ayana A. Miranda. Ayana covers art, architecture, urban design, and other facets of culture for the LA Times. Her work often looks at how the arts intersect with politics, gender, and race. She's a regular contributor to KCRW's Press Play and was a winner of the 2017 Rapkin Prize in Visual Arts Journalism. Thanks so much for moderating tonight, Ayana. Over to you.
Thank you for having me. I feel like you're the real deal TV host here. You'd probably be much better at this than me, but thank you for having me. I'm really excited. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm a little bit of a prepper, and I'm also into reading and science fiction. So I feel like we're going to have a very robust discussion tonight, thinking about how we understand climate change and social collapse through science fiction. Before we get started and I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to let everybody know that if you have a question, drop it in the question and answer module in the chat, and we will try to get those throughout the presentation. There'll be a question and answer session at the end. So Cheryl Vint, a scholar at UC Riverside, writes in the introduction to her book, Science Fiction, that even before the idea of climate change took hold, the genre embraced the geological and evolutionary timescales of 19th century science and began to think of the planet as something that preceded our species and could conceivably continue without us. So, you know, climate change and disaster related to climate change has been tackled by countless writers. J.G. Ballard, who wrote The Drowned World and The Burning World. It's been in film. I think, recently in Reminisce, a film in which much of Miami lies underwater, and of course in sci-fi fiction, Octavia Butler, and one of the masters of sci-fi, Kim Stanley Robinson, who will be here with us today. So without further ado, let's introduce these panelists. The first is Ayana Jamieson. She is a scholar who established the Octavia Butler Legacy Network, an organization that works to highlight the complex themes embodied in Butler's work. She has spent countless hours in Butler's archive reviewing the novelist's research, as well as her personal papers, which are fascinating. And those are now in the collection of the Huntington Library. And now for the Clockshot series Radio Imagination in 2016, Jamieson led a tour around places around LA that shaped Butler's life and writing. And I feel really bad that I didn't take it, and I hope she gives that tour again. Thank you, Ayana. Up next is Kim Stanley Robinson, who probably needs no introduction. In a recent profile of The New Yorker, historian Joshua Rothman wrote that the best descriptions of what this new world could be like come from Kim Stanley Robinson. He is a New York Times bestselling novelist, the author of more than 20 books, gripping sci-fi novels in which he has regularly explored issues of climate change. In New York 2140, he imagines a New York City submerged by fatal sea level rises. In The Ministry of the Future, which he published last year, he paints a vivid picture of calamitous global warming. So thank you, Stan, for joining us. Up next, Daniel Swain. He is a real deal climate scientist within UCLA's Institute of Environment and Sustainability, a research fellow at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and a California Climate Fellow at the Nature Conservancy. As of late, he and his colleagues have embarked on a number of projects dedicated to understanding a critical climate problem here in California, and that is fire, the recent surge of wildfire severity in our state, but also across the American West. So thank you, Daniel. And lastly, but not least, is John Bwarie. He's the founder of Stratoscope, a company that assists organizations with community engagement and resilience initiatives. Some of his firm's work has been in support of disaster risk reduction, as well as initiatives related to earthquake safety legislation. You may know him as the host of the Getting Through It podcast, in which he and seismologist Dr. Lucy Jones regularly discuss the scientific issues and sometimes a good deal of calamity that are shaping our world. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited about this. I wanted to start with Ministry of the Future and Stan. There is a chapter that opens, chapter 41 in his book opens with the sentence, "In the 12th year of continuous drought, our city ran out of water." Of course, we had been warned it would happen, but even in drought, some rain occasionally falls, and with conservation and fallowing of agriculture and construction of new reservoirs and pipelines to distant watersheds and digging of deeper wells and all of the rest of those efforts, we had always squeaked through. And that made us think it would keep on going that way. As a resident of Southern California, that is somewhat chilling words to read. And so I wanted to start with you, Stan. You know, in your earliest novels, you were inspired by the politics and mechanics of, say, of colonizing Mars. But in this one, in Ministry of the Future, which is set in this near future, I think a lot of it is in the 2030s, of melting ice caps, catastrophic heat waves. It's not this far off future of gee whiz gadgetry and aliens and spaceships. And I wanted to understand, first of all, why this near future scenario is intriguing to you as a writer. Like, why stick to the near future rather than go off into the distant past and into the distant future? And how do you imagine that in the context of Ministry of the Future? Like, what future are we looking at in that book?
Well, I would quickly divide science fiction because it's science fiction is story set in the future. I would divide it into far future, which is space opera, like Star Wars or Star Trek, near future, which is like Day After Tomorrow, like our various near future science fiction writers that project the present with a little bit of a trajectory on it. And then future history, which is much less common in the zone in between, say a century or two out. That's where I've written most of my novels because I found it interesting. And then it became obvious that it was important to write about climate change. And so I sort of jammed a lot of future history into the next 20 years, as if two kinds of science fiction were jammed into the same novel. If you think of science fiction as the realism of our time, because we're in a scientifically created world and because we're seem to be 1 foot in the future already, then it needs to be realistic. And so climate change has already started. It's the overriding consideration of our time. If you're going to write any literature, do any art, then it needs to take on climate change because that's the world we're in, and it's going to make a huge difference.
What world are you imagining in Ministry of the Future? Just for folks who haven't read the.
Well, the global situation in the next, say, 30 years max, starting from now, and it's a kind of a best case scenario, to tell you the truth. What I wanted to show was that no matter how bad the situation is now, which is quite desperately bad, as the latest IPCC report showed us, we are on the brink of causing a mass extinction event and passing certain planetary boundaries climactically that we could not claw back from, even if we made it our total civilizational project. We don't want to do that. We're right on the brink. So, but nevertheless, if we were to do things right starting from now and somewhat run the table, but also there'll be lots of defeats and failures along the way. But if we do things right starting now, we can dodge that mass extinction event and get to a best case scenario. I wanted to present that in a novel where it felt realistic even when you were done with it. So it was a kind of a literary, I won't say a trick, but it was a deliberate attempt to give a best case scenario that you can still believe in.
And this is, and if you haven't read the book, it's a best case scenario that opens with a devastating heat wave in Uttar Pradesh, if I'm not mistaken, in which millions die, and quite a cinematic opener to this
Well,
novel.
Yes, but I want to say that we are right on the edge of that. Wet bulb 35, and recently it's been calculated that it doesn't even have to be that hot. The combination of heat and humidity kills humans at a certain high combination of heat and humidity. This is a semi-new finding, and it changes everything because a lot of the globe, including the Southeast United States, one of the highest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was outside Chicago. We are not immune from these heat waves coming, and very soon we're going to be struck by one of these. So it had to be started. I had to show that as kind of a pop on the nose to get the reader's attention.
Well, it's definitely, I think if you were thinking about giving up fossil fuels before, that'll maybe like inspire that. I wanted to go, this is a great segue to Parable of the Sower, which in part, inspired the graphic for this talk. And because it is such an iconic piece of literature about Southern California, the beginning of chapter 3, Butler opens with the question of water, and she writes, "The cost of water has gone up again, and I heard on the news that more water peddlers are being killed. Peddlers sell water to squatters and the street poor and to people who've managed to hold on to their homes, but not to pay their utility bills. Peddlers are being found with their throats cut and their money and their hand trucks stolen. Dad says water now costs several times as much as gasoline." So Ayana, this, Butler published Parable of the Sower in 1993. The novel is set in 2024, this very dystopic Los Angeles landscape presents a very bleak picture of our city. Even though some of it feels very contemporary, I'd love to get a sense from you of, can you give us an overview of that picture that Butler was giving us, and what are the influences that shaped her novel? Like Stan draws quite directly from climate research. What were some of Butler's methods in tackling this topic?
So right here in chapter 3, there are so many things that happen that are deeply disturbing and troubling. And we have to remember that Lauren Olamina was born in 2009, and I believe she's turning 12 or turning 13 in our current timeline. So this is a person who's coming of age, witnessing people not being able to afford water, and it's more expensive than gasoline. And it's apparent that people are no longer relying on cars which we are so into these days are just rotting in people's driveways. And there's a lot of disagreement about the ways that money should be spent. A presidential election is upcoming. There's a lot of things happening that really give birth to this found religion that Lauren Olamina articulates as Earthseed in the novel. And one of the ways that Butler was inspired to write this book was climate change does appear as a character, an entity that's really moving of its own accord and doing what it does in these books, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. But it was actually an unconstitutional ballot initiative that passed and was struck down, whereby people who were undocumented would be left out of public services and education. And those are the things that she thought were disturbing, that we want a lot of.
Prop 187, correct?
Yes.
That'd be Prop 187, well.
Yes, Prop 187, which was passed and then struck down as unconstitutional. So she's thinking about people outside who don't have healthcare, who don't have access to education, public services, these middle-class services, garbage collection, et cetera, are all a thing of the past. The police coming to investigate people using water to put out fires, which we've experienced in the last 24 months, right? These are all things that inspired her because she was looking at the deregulation of protection of the environment and political decisions that were made that would have a future detrimental effect. If you read Dr. Shelley Streeby's book on climate change and Octavia Butler, you see that she dove into the archives and saw that Butler was talking about climate change in the 1960s and 1970s, before we had climate change as a feature of our haunted imaginations. So a lot of social science things and political things inspired her, in addition to those environmental factors that Stan pointed to.
What do you think makes this book so it just seems to become more resonant with each passing year? What aspect of her vision of this near future do you think strikes such a chord?
Well, one thing that freaked people out is that she looked at President Ronald Reagan's slogan, "Make America Great." And it just so happens that we had a president who reused that slogan, so everyone thought she predicted the future. That's one reason, but also that it's 2022 now, and we haven't solved these issues, and we do have more widespread disparity between peoples, across the board. Other already eliminated diseases coming back, a virus, drug addiction, and all kinds of things that are really compounded in this situation that we are not quite have emerged from in COVID-19.
Yeah, I think one of the more impactful things for me on rereading this book for this panel was her descriptions of this Los Angeles landscape, covered in these like squatter camps and these fires, and in an era in which these communities of unhoused and fire, it sounds like she is describing our city of today. I wanted to switch on since we are talking about fire, on the note of fire, I wanted to talk to Daniel a little bit, because this is the phenomena that you study. And so I'd love to get a broad sense from you of like how wildfires have changed, but also what are the specific issues that you're looking at in your work? I mean, I think we all know it's like drier, not as much rain, but I'd love to get a sense of some of the specifics of what you're looking at.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think I'll start with the kind of the range of things that I do study as a climate scientist, which does include, of course, wildfire in a changing climate, but also droughts and heat waves, as well as the other end of the spectrum, very large flood events, which is something we don't think about very much in California these days in the midst of drought and wildfire and water scarcity. But that's also something that looms large in a warming climate. And there's actually an event in Stan's book where there is this catastrophic flood in Southern California. And I think what's emerged in the science that sort of merges these two narratives that were created in very different decades at different points along the spectrum of real world climate change is that we actually, increasingly, the science is suggesting that we have to think about all of these things. So it's not just that we're going to be perennially drier, see more water scarcity. We will, and we are. But in addition to that, we have to cope with the fact that we'll have to experience these extremes on the opposite side of the hydrologic spectrum, with increasingly large floods that punctuate these increasingly severe droughts. And so in some ways, that really complicates the big picture. But when it comes to wildfire, I think that's really been the event of the decade in California. It hasn't been earthquakes, it hasn't been floods, it's been fire, based on what's happened over the past few years. And there really has been a dramatic escalation in the severity and the extent affected by wildfires, both in California and really broadly throughout the American West and in fire-prone regions globally. And a pretty big part of this is directly attributable to the warming temperatures that we've seen and the effects that has on the vegetation and on atmospheric humidity. And this is true even in places that aren't necessarily seeing less precipitation on average, because these warmer temperatures essentially affect the water balance. So you can imagine, even if you have the same amount of water falling from the sky as precipitation, if you have more of it evaporating back into the atmosphere because it's warmer and the atmosphere is drier, that same amount of water that you had historically, it just isn't going to go as far. And so this is one of those areas, I think, where we've historically underestimated, at least in certain scientific circles, the impacts of climate change. We've gotten the amount of warming right. So the amount of global warming, the amount of regional warming in California that's occurred is about where we thought we would be at this point. But wildfire is one of those places where the impacts, I think, are accelerating faster than we might have expected from that amount of warming. So there are a lot of scenes out of both of these narratives that really jump out at me as somebody who studies all of these different kinds of extreme events and how they're changing. The prevalence of fire in California, the shocking occurrence of an incredibly extreme, unprecedented heat wave in a region unprepared for it, the occurrence of an equally extreme flood event, even in the places that are affected by water scarcity. All of these rang pretty true based on not just what we've seen, but also what we expect to see in the coming years from a climate science perspective.
So this pendulum that swings ever more violently back and forth, it sounds like. Yeah,
especially in a place like California, we've called that precipitation whiplash, and it really is this increased variability, increasingly wide swings of the pendulum.
So as a climate scientist, which I'm sure must be like a great, when people ask you at a bar what you do and you say climate scientist, it probably elicits all kinds of interesting reactions. So as a climate scientist, I want to know, like, are you an avid consumer of sci-fi? You know, we've had all of these like interesting projects. You know, I think of the more extreme cinematic Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow, a giant tidal wave decimates New York and a new ice age is issued. You know, Bong Joon-ho's Snowpiercer. You know, in what ways does, what do you think of it? And then also, in what ways does this kind of art, I guess, support some of the points you're trying to make, but in what ways does it not? In what ways can it be damaging?
Well, I'd say that yes, I'm an avid consumer of sci-fi, both good and bad. I think that they both have their place. You know, I'll watch bad disaster movies as much as the next person, and probably more than the next person. And sometimes to critique them, but sometimes because sometimes there is an interesting kernel of truth in there. And I think that sort of something that a contemporary or a fairly contemporary example a lot of people are probably familiar with is that Roland Emmerich Day After Tomorrow type, or that specific film, where it's of course ridiculous, but there is a real kernel of truth regarding the kind of collapse of the North Atlantic oceanic circulation that would have profound effects on global climate, sudden and profound effects. And that has happened in the Earth's past, and it could happen in the Earth's future. So obviously it wouldn't look exactly as portrayed on screen, but that kernel of truth, I always think, is actually a really interesting place to start. And I think that, you know, some of my favorite science fiction, I think, is the science fiction that really is in tune with what the science says about the world. Not that it's a scientific tome by any means, but that science fiction that really engages at a deeper level with either things we've seen in the real world, in society, or in the environment, or things that are hypothesized perhaps by science, things that may not even be obvious or necessarily in front of you today, but really are truly plausible glimpses of you know, a future that might come, which of course is the whole point. But I think that there are different degrees of scientific realism that come out of that. And I think that, you know, when it comes to these two particular works, there are more than kernels of truth, I think, in terms of what the real world looks like today or could look like in a decade or two versus how it's portrayed. And I think that we have sort of, on the one hand, one portrayal that is, as Stan suggested, kind of optimistic. I mean, I found this contemporary look to actually be a fairly optimistic view of what could happen moving forward, how we might, despite some really awful events that transpire in the short to medium term, ultimately fix the problem, partly because of the shock of what might be to come. And then we have, I think, what's arguably a pretty pessimistic portrayal of what a future could look like in this part of the world. And, you know, the good news is we're not going to be there in 2024, but the fact that there are enough things that raise the hair on your neck is saying a lot. I think the fact that there are elements, the prevalence or the omnipresence almost of fire on the landscape, something that I think that people in California would have thought was a lot more far-fetched even just 10 or 15 years ago. But after the last 5 or 10 years of experience, it appears much less hyperbolic. I think the number of people who have run from walls of flames in the middle of the night or who have awoken to Blade Runner orange sky is another work of science fiction that predicted a specific visual that has actually transpired in the past couple of years in California, I think is fascinating and a little bit alarming. So you can kind of interpolate between these things. I am really worried that at some point in the next decade or two, we will see a heat wave like the one that's described as occurring in India. It'll happen probably somewhere in the global south, probably somewhere in the tropical or subtropical belt. And it might look more or less as was portrayed in that chapter. We will, and so to me, it's a little, it's as an avid consumer of science fiction, it's both fascinating to see sometimes how prophetic these portrayals can become, but also kind of alarming given that I do study the details of this and I do have an acute sense of real world physical risk and what might actually happen. And the fact that some of these things are not very far-fetched is not especially reassuring.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that metaphor of, I think for a long time, climate change, the metaphor was, we're like the frog in the water that's being slowly turned up and we don't know we're being boiled. And now we are actively being boiled. So we are at that point. So going back to think about that optimistic next step, if humanity were to pull it together for that purpose, I wanted to turn to John, because John does community organizing has done community organizing around disasters. So I'd love to get a sense from you, John, thinking about, you've worked with organizations within the legal system to make our infrastructure and our systems more resilient, to things like earthquakes. So I'd love to get a sense from you of, what does art achieve in that realm? Like, what do these books teach us about the ways in which we need to become resilient? Like, I think back to Parable of the Sower, Lauren was so about like preparing herself, and her father prepared her and taught her to make this acorn bread with nuts that could be harvested from native trees. And it was all about this like continuous preparation for being able to live off the landscape as it exists. Sorry, it's been a long day. And so I'd love to know, John, from you as someone who does some of this organizing, what do you think these stories can do to help us, get in that frame of like, okay, we do need to learn how to make the acorn bread. We are there.
Right. Well, I think listening to my fellow panelists, I think it's really, there's a reality here that we have to deal with about changing Earth, right? This is not what we had even 20 years ago, as Daniel just mentioned. But what's important to note about this work, the work of Parable of the Sower and Mr. Robinson's work, is that art actually is a greater motivator for action than, unfortunately, sorry, Daniel, the straight facts, right? We are evolved as human beings to respond to stories, emotional reactions to things. It's how we evolved. And though we have a capacity for logic and for facts and to understand how to process the reality of what we're facing, it's through art and the emotions that come with art, creative writing and other forms of art, that really elicit the greatest action in us as human beings. And so when we look at this kind of work, we can take away the call to action that's in there, whether it's explicit or as you just described, it's sort of implicit, the idea that we can model what we're seeing others do to respond to a future that maybe we don't want to experience. So how might we prepare for that? I think one of the key aspects here, as you think about actions we might take, is that we can't work alone at this. And I think that's a really big message that I recall from Parable of the Sower. It's really in community, right? It's working with your neighbors and finding those folks to be a part of your effort to survive. But that's also what we can do to mitigate and change the outcome. And so when we look at stories like this, or the more fantastical stories, perhaps that, as we keep referencing that big wave on the East Coast, we can learn from it and we react to it and we connect more. So it's a way to reach people, and the people we're trying to reach are individuals like those of us here on this panel, but it's also policymakers. It's also individuals in neighborhoods and communities who need to connect with each other in order to make the changes necessary so that we can prevent what might happen, or more importantly, manage, adapt to what might happen and survive and thrive on the other side of that.
I think, you know, that raises, John, that raises such a good point about this connection between the environmental and the social. And you know, that's so prominent in Stan's book, that's so prominent in Parable of the Sower. And so Stan, going to you, you know, Ministry of the Future pulls at those threads. I mean, it kind of imagines, I always think the story is basically this ministry that is charged with imagining, advocating for the people of the future at the level of climate, and it goes into, you know, policy that shapes land use, the labor that's affected by those policies. It determines who is and isn't a climate refugee. And so I wanted to get a sense from you of like why, and the book has some absolutely amazing, very short chapters. One of my favorites is there's a chapter literally written from the point of view of the market. You know, we idolize the free market, and there's a chapter from the point of view of the market. I found that really interesting. But I wanted to talk to you, I wanted to ask you, why is it important to explore those points of connection between the social and the environmental?
Well, it's almost a artificial distinction because the environment is simply our extended body, and we are, you know, only 50% of the DNA in your body is human DNA. And this semi-new finding is a mind boggler because any individual is also a forest or a swamp. And it's a remarkable act of collaboration between all kinds of agents to make you be who you are. And then that extends out into the environment. So if you try to hold your breath for 2 minutes, you can't, and you realize you're part of the rest of the earth. And it goes on and on like that, eating and existing in the world with other people and other elements. But I was want to respond to something that John said, that this matter of storytelling. One thing I think is going on with Ministry for the Future that has caused the response to the book that has happened with it, which has been remarkable in the context of my own career, I can testify, is nothing that any of us do as individuals will be enough. So you live like that, you think, gosh, I know there's a global problem, I'm doing the best I can, it won't be enough. But if you realize that you're just one brick in a wall, if there's a story being told that means that explains or explores how you're in solidarity with other people that you don't know, how your part of the puzzle fits in, and that it makes one jigsaw piece, and then there's a bigger pattern that's going to be made, or one brick in the wall. You see the design of the wall in your head. I'm going to put this brick in here, and it might still work. It won't. It's not all up to me. So this is what I think has caused the response, is people thinking, we as a society could indeed succeed here in dodging a mass extinction event. And so it gives people hope to continue on their own, specifically inadequate, but part of a larger project. And people want that. People want that larger story to click their project into.
You know, that it leads to somebody named Cyber Swimmer has dropped a great little question / comment into the chat for Stan. It says, one of the most compelling aspects of Ministry for the Future was the global inaction that Stan portrayed so well. And I was listening my way through the book at the same time that Don't Look Up came out, which was that Netflix movie about the meteor. I don't want to do any spoilers, but a meteor headed straight for Earth. We are in the age of inaction, and there is no meaningful chance that, quote unquote, humanity will act now or soon. So is it time for the carbon coin?
Well, it is time for the carbon coin, because the carbon coin is a symbolic way of talking about all of the necessary financial and economic changes that we need to make to pay ourselves to do the good work rather than for continuing to doing bad work. That's a fundamental flip that we have to make. And I've written before about this period of inaction. I called it the Great Dithering. In Ministry for the Future, the timeline is completely wrong. When I said in the Ministry for the Future that, you know, the 2030s were zombie years and people were still not acting, that is not right. I wrote that book in 2019, a darker time. And what has happened since Biden got elected and since the pandemic struck us in the face is everybody realizes we're in it now. And really, this is not the age of great inaction. This is the wake-up call moment. Since I've been writing climate fiction since around 2000 or so, I know it's different now. I feel it, I can tell. Everything that I wrote about in Ministry of the Future that I spread over 30 years is going to happen in 5 to 10 years. And this is a good thing, because it means that the response will be intense and electrifying. And there will be feelings of panic that we aren't doing enough. We can see the discrepancy between what we need to do and what we're really doing. And that will widen in the next few years. And young people will get angrier. People at the pointy edge of the spear will get angrier. But on the other hand, it's the world's problem right now. It's really become the central event in global history right now. And that just wasn't true, even when I wrote Ministry in 2019. So we got to get used to this incredible acceleration.
This is a perfect point, Stan. Thank you for that. To also go to Ayana, there was a question that came in from a member of the audience who writes, in Parable of the Sower or in Butler's work in general, are the climate catastrophes a direct or nearly direct result of the social issues you discuss, such as Proposition 187, or is climate catastrophe a physical symptom or legacy of ongoing policies of social inequality? So is it maybe using that as a metaphor, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that Butler continues to return to, is that it's both and. It's not science or society. It's not these sort of human services policies or political or, you know, science policy. It's both at the same time. And I think when I look at some fiction and I see what's happening in science fiction and superhero movies and all of these things, I always want to say, as a mythologist, what is the undercurrent of myth? Like, what is a story that's being told, and whose voice is being silenced or not heard or not respected? And I think about, you know, people living by freeways, or people who say, you know, no pipeline in my backyard, put that somewhere else in the poor neighborhood, or let's tear down this poor neighborhood. So it is those policies that continue to solidify privilege while silencing others, that continue to exacerbate the problems of access to the natural world, places for children to play outside with grass, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's both and at the same time. And those are the things that she saw. Like, remember during the pandemic, people didn't have access to the library, right? When libraries are a place where people without those resources or safe places to be can go for free without paying any money to have access to information. So I don't know the solution, but I think we're in the middle of a rapid acceleration also of these same social inequalities being magnified via the pandemic and other policies that have not supported people historically.
You know, that's a great segue to think about who we think about when we think about the environmental movement. You know, there have long been stereotypes of environmentalism as the environmental movement as a quote unquote white movement, you know, yet Black communities and communities of color, as you pointed out, have been very active in questions of land use, pollution, where freeways are built, contending with climate disasters like hurricanes. There are a lot of, you know, Black women on the ground in the South contending with those issues. Yet these activists aren't always, you know, given the airtime that they are due. And so I'd love to get a sense from you, Ayana, of why Butler's vision in Parable of the Sower, which centers a young Black woman, a girl becoming a woman, this incredible coming of age story, why it's so important to center that Black perspective in such the setting of calamity.
I think one of the very smart things that Butler does is she uses what we call this Black feminist epistemology, where if Black women are taken care of or centered, that means every single other person who needs something, their needs will also be addressed. And everyone in Butler's configuration of people that she gathers in Earthseed, they're from every racialized background, class. There's so many different people that she's gathering along the way, and she's looking around her like, who else can be uplifted in this? Who else needs to survive? What else can we do to make this sustainable? And those are the kinds of things that we have seen that produce results. When we think about like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, that one election, right, was a catalyst for all these other things that have happened since that time, including that help to get Biden elected and to flip the Senate to that small degree, right? So I do think that's part of what she's doing, and she's doing it unapologetically from the get-go, from the very beginnings of her fiction way back in 1974, 1975. And that's remarkable. And she's saying, I'm the only Black woman science fiction writer writing now, but then she opened the door for so many other people along the way.
Yeah, her books are among my favorites, a treasure. I also believe, if I'm not mistaken, is that a poster of Mami Wata behind you?
This behind me is actually Tara, the only manifestation of Buddha to be reincarnated in a female body. So she's in a lotus flower. She has an eye on her forehead. And it's something I found when I was in like Cambria, going to visit the Hertz Castle, first female architect, right? Something I found by accident just before going to work at the state capitol in 2003 when Arnold was taking over. I mean, something totally accidental, but analogous to Mami Wata, so that's a good catch. I mean, not
I thought you had a water deity. I was like, this is just too perfect.
She's floating in the tear of Buddha.
Yeah, I think, that is a perfect metaphor. I wanted to switch quickly back to Stan. I'd love to get, because the novel does delve into issues of policy and economics and the market and regulation, where in the novel are you drawing from life, and where do you just go reach for the invention? How do you balance that?
I don't know. I think it's all from life. There's nothing in Ministry for the Future. Not only was I not ahead of the curve, but I hadn't even caught up to things that were really happening. So I would write about the carbon coin, and it turns out the central banks have been talking about this since 2017. Or I wrote about glaciers having the water sucked out from their bottom sides. That was a paper in Nature that I didn't know about from 10 years before I wrote the book. You can't keep up. No individual can keep up. It's going faster worldwide. And really the work of science as a set of nested institutions and millions of people that are using a similar methodology and procedural language and interacting in a massive economy that isn't entirely a capitalist economy, but a gift economy, where they give their work, they share their work, they do peer review. There's tons of stuff going on in science that is outside the dominant paradigm, and essentially is a utopian force of people who are saying, well, I'm just going to put my hands to what I can do right now. So as a science fiction writer, I follow that. It's like grabbing a tiger by the tail. You can barely hold on. So I don't make up anything. That's what it comes down to.
So I think we can then say Ministry for the Future is perhaps some very lyrically written climate.
Well, thank you for that. Yes. Prose poems trying to follow what really is happening in the world. Or if you remember those movies from the 1940s where women usually were telephone operators, they'd be plugging in plugs. You put people together, you plug in a plug, another voice speaks, just get out of the way and let the voices speak. It's one of the most beautiful feelings that a novelist can have, is to get out of the way. Novels are not about self-expression. They're about getting out of the way. And I met Octavia Butler once, and it was only once. It was a beautiful meeting. And she was a powerful presence, and she made me laugh. She won an award that night, and she got up on stage and she said, "I became a writer precisely to avoid situations like this one." And it was a great experience to have had this conversation with her. And she, I think, was a visionary and had a presence and a vision that she needed people to know about. She was bringing news that was truly new to a lot of people. And the science fiction community was great to be so quick to pick up her work and to make her one of our stars. It's something to be proud of. But I myself really just am a sort of a science journalist guy who tries to turn it into stories that will bring those scientific stories alive. It's not that it doesn't have that social visionary quality that I see in Butler all the time. And the fact that she's a giant star now, years after her death, years after the books came out, it speaks to the power. These short novels were rather awesome.
Well, I think to want to make that change, you have to have some faith. And I think that's something like Parable of the Sower really embodies. But, you know, thinking about those scientific voices, I wanted to cut back to Daniel, because I think it was Stan or Daniel, one of you mentioned the IPCC report. This is the latest UN report on climate change, which has issued some really stark warnings of vulnerability of certain populations to extreme heat, rising sea levels. Approximately 700 million people around the world are experiencing longer dry spells. You know, we know some of the general concerns in California. We've discussed them: drought, coastal erosion, fire season, and with the occasional flood. But Daniel, I'd love to know from you as a scientist, you know, Stan posits solutions in his book, and certainly Octavia Butler is looking at others in her own. What are some of the two, you know, maybe one or two immediate changes you'd like to see to the way that we as individuals live in California? I mean, is it about the way we manage agriculture? Is it about cutting water usage? Is it about driving less? Like, what are I imagine your wish list is as thick as a phone book, but if you had to put a couple at the top, what are those?
Yeah, it's a question I get all the time. And my initial response is usually that there isn't an ordered list at all. And that's actually the point, which is that there really is no one or two things that are going to do most of the work to fix the problem. There are so many things that have to happen essentially at the same time, so many aspects of the way really society works and functions that will have to change to solve this global problem on a timescale that's fast enough to avoid some of the really bad outcomes. Is that there isn't really a ranked list. I don't really have a top 1, 2, 3 things, because what we really need is to make it easier, trivially easy for people to make good choices. Trivially easy for anybody of any means anywhere in the world to make choices that not only don't make the problem worse, but that essentially work to address the underlying issues. And right now, for a variety of reasons in a variety of contexts, it's not easy to make decisions that work towards meaningfully solving the problem because of the way that societal structures are currently arranged. So my response is often not what people expect. It's not use more energy efficient light bulbs, or, you know, encourage the owner of your apartment building to install better insulation. All these things are great, but they're, you know, it's really spitting at a forest fire. The aggregate of the individual actions in that sense will not and cannot solve the problem, but where the place where individual actions become important and can solve the problem is to the extent that they exert pressure on societal systems to change in a way that makes it possible for everyone to make good choices. And so really, I think the most important things are, you know, from the perspective of a climate scientist, if it's climate change that we're talking about, first of all, it's talking about climate change. The majority of people in the country and in the world never hear a word about climate change in an average week or an average month. Not a single word. The majority of Americans say they never hear about it. It never comes up in conversation. So in that sense, the notion that it's this universally talked about thing these days, we are living in a bit of a bubble where it is. That's not universally the case. So talking about it, not just as an academic or hypothetical topic, but in common conversation. Everyone always talks about chatting about the weather as the sort of the quintessential piece of casual conversation you might have with a stranger in a coffee shop. Climate change should also be part of that conversation. But it's also, honestly, it's being politically active. It's being involved in your community and involved at larger scales, and making climate a big part of the decisions that you make in that engagement, and pressuring others to make that a significant consideration as well. Because the first thing that needs to happen is you need to make it possible for everyone to make choices that help solve the problem. Right now, it's really difficult for everybody to make the same level of contribution. You hear, oh, buy an electric car. Well, not everyone owns a car, or if they do, they can't afford an electric car. Or you live in an apartment building, you can't charge an electric car. Eat a specific diet. Well, maybe globally we probably should move in a certain direction with diet, but when you try and impose that on individual people, that also poses a lot of problems. And so I don't like the idea of shaming people for their personal carbon footprint or not. As we know, even the notion of a carbon footprint came out of the oil industry as a way of sort of pushing the blame away and putting it onto individuals rather than on these large entities that have contributed or created essentially in the long run the problem. So my answer is often a little bit different than what people expect it to be in that respect. But I think it's really important to recognize that climate change is a global problem, and it's not just a scientific problem, but all the solutions, they're not technological solutions, will help along the way, but fundamentally implementation of those technological solutions is a social question, not a scientific one. So that's where the solutions are going to lie.
I think that's a great point to turn to John, because you have done some organizing around, because I think, the problem is so big and requires so many different changes at so many different scales. So John, I'd love to get a sense from you as someone who has done community organizing and resilience, in relation to your earthquake work and some of your other work, have you seen models that are interesting to you?
Sure.
What are some of the things you would like to see in this area?
Sure. I think to just piggyback on Daniel's point, it's great to always follow you. He's got it right, that everyone has to see themselves as part of the solution, that they can be part of it. Individually, they're not going to solve it, but they have to see that it's possible for something to be done. And in that way, the way that we created, for instance, California Clean Air Day as a way that everybody could do something to take one action that would clean the air. And we didn't make it about climate specifically, in order to make sure that people saw that it wasn't the politics of, because as Daniel mentioned, it's sometimes been politicized. It just was about breathing better air, which in turn helped us address some climate issues. But I think what it all comes down to fundamentally is that it's local action that spurs regional action that then spurs national action. And I think a great example of this, something everyone should be aware of, is the movement for chief resilience officers in local cities, and now we're starting to see them in states. And in fact, there's a Resilience 21 network of these chief resilience officers from cities like Houston, New York, and Los Angeles, and around the country and really around the globe, that started a movement a few years ago. But what it says is that it puts people responsible for addressing these issues and leading all aspects of local government, which is probably the easiest form of government to move, frankly, towards a direction of addressing some of these most important shocks to the systems or stressors, which are often climate induced, or they could be earthquake, which is unrelated to climate. But in this moment where a chief resilience officer is talking to the mayor of Los Angeles or the mayor of Houston or the mayor of Washington, D.C., they're changing the dialogue around what we're worrying about. It's not just about parking tickets, traffic, potholes, and tree trimming. It's now what that all means in concept of what the future might hold in terms of resilience. And so we're actually seeing, I think it's the state of Washington that has now adopted a state resilience officer. And this group came together and called on Congress and the president when he took office to establish a chief resilience officer for the nation, a U.S. chief resilience officer, someone whose responsibility would be to build the resilience of this nation towards the calamities of the future, because they are coming. No matter how much work we talk about and work, before it ends, it will have more calamity. And so we have to be prepared to adapt to those things. And so again, it starts local. And I think this idea of someone responsible advising those in positions of power to make a change could be the way that we start to make progress locally, and then again, regionally and nationally.
That's such an interesting point, because there are cities that have also hired chief heat officers on dealing with heat. So the city of Athens has a heat officer. I think Phoenix was talking about having a heat officer because things such as cooling centers and how you deal with heat, how you landscape for heat, how you design cities for heat, all of these things come into play. So I am getting some questions starting to pour in, and I don't want to hog the mic. There were a couple of related questions, and I'm going to direct this at Ayana and Stan about what kind of science fiction. I'll ask them both together, and you can kind of pick which part of the question you want to ask. What kind of science fiction would you like to, let's see, what would the panel to see? Science fiction, what would you like to see science fiction authors writing about in the next 10 or 5 to 10 years? And then somebody else adding, what stories should California writers be telling as we try to keep our state at the forefront of the climate crisis fight? So Ayana, do you want to start? I'm sorry for my incompetently phrased question.
So part of the question was, what kind of science fiction or what kind of fiction should authors be writing?
Or would you like to see?
Would I like to see
in the next 5 or 10 years?
I definitely think that there's not enough women, not enough whole women, and not enough community fiction things that are being written. Right now, I've been reading authors who are not science fiction writers, but are most certainly addressing climate change in their fantasy, romance, and all kinds of other genres. And I think there needs to be some commitment for science fiction writers and other writers to embrace that kind of diversity of genre, because we're missing out on lots of really poignant narratives when we're only reading the things we like or only watching the movies we like. And also in children's literature and young people's literature, I think if we want to uplift stories and evoke emotion, like John was saying, we need to read more. We need to offer children more narratives where they can, that can instill the sense of responsibility and civic engagement in them. And there are authors doing that. I mean, there's some really wonderful and beautiful things being written, and sometimes there's not even people in them. So I definitely think we need to do more to bridge that speculative literature. There's speculation in every genre, even ones that are dismissed out of hand because mostly women are reading them, or only children are reading them, or they're supposed to be young adult fiction, but it's all great stuff that fuels our imagination and our passions for living, surviving into the future.
What about you, Stan?
Well, I'm reluctant to prescribe what other writers ought to be doing, but it seems to me that if art responds to the reality of its own time and society, that inevitably there has to be climate fiction. And science fiction has always been the genre where the stories are set in the future. That's the basic definition. You set a story in the future, you immediately reveal a theory of society, a theory of history, a political position. That's all gets revealed by what you think is going to happen and how you tell the story of who the important actors are and who they aren't. More community, more solidarity, more post-capitalism. There's a new subgenre, they're calling themselves solar punk writers. This is like a do-it-yourself response to climate change by taking what we've got and taking individual initiative. But as Daniel pointed out, the problems being systemic and holistic, fiction has a strange problem, because fiction is about characters and about individuals and their relationships to their society, their family, and history at large. it's science fiction that takes the relationship to the planetary level and the long-term level. So I think science fiction is indeed a natural genre to take on the problems of writing about the collective and what people do as groups. And it's a narrative problem for the writer. It has to be figured out. I mean, you saw in Ministry for the Future, I had eyewitness accounts, maybe 20 or 30 individuals. You don't even know their names. They speak to you once, they tell you what's important to their life, they go away. Well, that's one method, but since it's always character-based, you have to keep figuring out ways to tell stories about people and how they act in ways that the readers will be encouraged by. And more of that, it would be really good to see.
I have a little
John,
bit of a follow-up.
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If it's okay. Well, I don't know if I think science fiction always is addressing the future. For example, there's a book I have in mind where there's this woman who is a water activist, and she ends up becoming the first lady, but she's Native American. So can you imagine the speculative possibilities of a Native American woman becoming the first lady of the United States, married to a climate scientist who wants to find a way to monetize the things that we're talking about so that people will heal the planet and be capitalists at the same time. It's an author, her name is Kennedy Ryan, and she wrote this Kingmaker series. Like this speculative present is an alternative reality that certainly helps us dream, even if we don't like Star Trek. So I would say maybe I politely disagree that science fiction is always about the future, because when we need to ask people what they're doing, how they're feeling, and how they're living now. And that's a problem we have. That's why we have climate issues, because we're not asking people what they think and what they need. What needs do they need to be met, as Daniel said, in order to make the choice that is the easiest choice, that's the most sustainable choice for everyone to be included.
I wanted to go, there's a reader question that is slightly tied to this, but before I go to that, I had a flash question for John and Daniel. John, do you have an essential piece of sci-fi, be it a movie or a book, that's a favorite? Just since we are talking.
Yeah, I don't want to out myself here as which genre of science fiction, stimulates my thoughts from being a teenager into present. But it is the what's streaming on Paramount Plus right now. All the Star Trek are my go-to for that. The Roddenberryan, future of everybody working together, and that we can find an opportunity to make things better because we work together. And that sort of resonated with me as a teenager, and that sort of propelled me into the work that I'm doing in many ways of bringing community together to address some of our most critical issues.
Thank you. Daniel, do you have a favorite piece of sci-fi?
Yeah, in terms of literature, I think it would actually be Cat's Cradle, which isn't traditionally science fiction, but I think the science fiction elements in it, I think a lot of Kurt Vonnegut stuff. I think it helped that his brother was an atmospheric scientist, and a lot of that made it into Kurt Vonnegut's writings. But I think that would be literature-wise, that's close to the top. And I think contemporary, I was a big fan of The Expanse. I know a lot of other scientists who were as well, for a variety of reasons. And so I think it's good storytelling, but as a scientist, it's also it's very satisfying as very thoroughly researched and visualized science fiction too.
Thank you. So there was Ayana had made a point earlier about our visions of how do we fit these visionary worlds within our systems of capital. Though I might turn this question to Stan. Somebody asks, James Dunbar asks, speculative futures are implicit critiques of capital accumulation, extraction, expropriation. How instrumental does the panel think these narratives warnings are in imagining a post-capital world? And I think, Stan, I'm going to start with you, because I know you come at this from a leftist perspective.
Yes, I certainly do. And thank you for that. Capitalism is one name for our problem. Appropriation of other people's work, extraction, unsustainable extraction of planetary resources. We're wrecking people's lives, and we're wrecking the planet by a false system of measurement and power. Profit itself is now at this point just a a metric of how much damage we're doing. So a new political economy is very much needed and needs to be imagined in fiction. And political economists, and this means economists, although they often don't do the full job of imagining difference, they just analyze what already exists. So someone has to step in there and say it could be different. We could pay ourselves, we could establish a wage ratio between 1 and 10, and then and 1 means adequacy, where you have dignity and adequacy. 10 times that is all the luxury anybody would need, maybe a bit more, and not the typical 1 to 1,500 that we have in the American system right now. You could tax your way to that. You could begin to do a kind of progressive fiction that talked about political actions taking place in the world and hope that the reader believes in it enough to have their minds open to possibilities that are currently available to us. And I would agree with Ayana, you know, that what you told this woman, the Native American, as First Lady, well, yes, and now we've got one as Secretary of the Interior. You tell the stories and then it happens. But I have a very ecumenical view of science fiction. If you put a story that starts tomorrow and something new happens, that's near future science fiction right there. It's when you put it 5 years ago or you put it in the present and people are worrying about their latest personality crisis as the subject of your fiction, that's when you've gone weak and soft and haven't seized the nettle of our current problem. And those stories they can pass the time, but they're useless in terms of spurring us to action or giving us encouragement to do new things. So I am a science fiction patriot, but it's partly because I have this definition of it where when you describe difference, like Cat's Cradle that Daniel mentioned, Vonnegut was a great science fiction writer. He renounced it because he wanted to be on the bestseller list. And in the early 1960s, you were not going to make the bestseller list by proclaiming you were a science fiction writer. Even great writers like Asimov could not make a dime doing science fiction in those years. So Vonnegut said, well, I don't do that. I do Vonnegut. It was a smart move. But the story is available to us by imagining difference. I think that's the crucial, and no matter which way you imagine difference in the present or in the future, or even in alternative histories in the past, although that's relatively weak form, these are ways to give us encouragement that things can be different.
So we are down to the 4-minute mark. This went flying past, and I wanted to get to a question from Quentin, who says, having meaningful climate stories in written literature is great, but I keep thinking about the audience. With most of the world's eyes these days on screens instead of in books, are these climate stories making their way into films and TV shows? What progress, if any, is happening here? As an example, will there be a ministry for the future Netflix series? So I think we'll start with you, Stan.
Well, I don't know. I'm just the writer. It's not in my hands. The ministry has been optioned, and it seems like a very ambitious and accomplished studio and crew. A writer's been hired, a young woman who's kind of amazing. It all looks good, but in Hollywood, you can't believe a thing until it's actually on the screen in front of your eyes. So I am not holding my breath, but I will say this, don't look up. That movie was a smack in the chops and got people talking and laughing, which is a very powerful weapon. So, you know, who knows, but yes, every media ought to be doing this stuff, yes.
I wanted to, this is a great opportunity. Ayana, I wanted to end with you. You know, Octavia Butler's work in recent years has started to emerge into other platforms. I've seen comic books, I've seen other things. What are some of the more imaginative? I mean, I hope we see a movie based on her work at some point. What have you seen out there that that brings her work into the digital medium or filmmaking?
There's a couple of things. Well, we know someone mentioned in the chat Lagoon and Nnedi Okorafor. Nnedi Okorafor is one of the people adapting Wild Seed to for television. Kindred has already filmed a pilot close by here, and they're filming the rest of the season. FX has ordered it, but there are also people doing Black speculative arts in real life. There's a waterfront in Canada where they installed this like Olamina art installation that had plants on it where people could go and be differently near the waterfront. So there's lots of action taking place, and there are lots of adaptations of Butler's work, such as the graphic novels. And also there's a Parable of the Sower opera written by Toshi Reagan and her mother, Bernice Johnson Reagan. That's brilliant and beautiful, and over 200 years of the history of Black music in America. So there's so many beautiful and rich things that are happening. And of course, Parable of the Sower made the bestsellers list in 2020 in September, I believe, for the first time. And I feel that we all can take credit for our nerdery and think about what other works will be uplifted in that genre, or other authors that we love who are doing tremendous and beautiful work.
Thank you so much. And I just want to shout out one comment which said we haven't mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin, so I am mentioning her. Sorry about that, folks. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. I could sit here for another hour and have this discussion. I will pass things back to you, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina, and thanks to all the panelists. I saw a number of comments in the chat about this being, the greatest panel ever, and I'm hard pressed to disagree. So I know if we were in a room, this is when everybody would clap. But just accept our thanks. You're all doing amazing work. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight.